Elliot Dade was 41 years old, for days after burying his father, and standing completely still in the hallway of his own home when he heard his wife laugh. Not a polite laugh. Not the kind of sound a person makes to fill silence. It was the specific, unguarded laugh of a woman who felt entirely safe, relaxed in a way she had not been around Elliot in longer than he could honestly remember. He had come home early that evening, still in the dark clothes he'd worn to meet with the funeral home director, carrying the particular exhaustion that comes not just from grief but from the logistics of grief. The paperwork, the phone calls, the careful management of other people's emotions while your own sit untouched in a corner waiting for a moment that never quite arrives. He had his keys in his hand. He had not yet crossed the threshold of the kitchen. He stood in the hallway, between the front door and the turn that would have made him visible, and he listened. Her voice came from the living room, low, warm, easy. She was saying, "No, he's not back yet. He's been at the funeral home all day." A pause. Then the laugh again. Then, I know. Just a little longer. I just need a little more time to get things in order." Another pause, shorter. Then her voice dropped even lower and she said, "Des, I've been done for a long time. You know that." The hallway smelled like the casserole a neighbor had dropped off that morning, and the faint trace of the candle Lorraine burned in the evenings. Something with vanilla in it that he had never particularly liked. He stood in that smell and in that silence and let the full meaning of what he was hearing settle into him without rushing it. He did not storm into the room. He did not announce himself. He turned around, quietly, and went back outside. He sat in his car in the driveway for 11 minutes. Then he drove to his father's house in Gehenna, sat in Walter's armchair in the dark, and thought for a long time. He did not say a word to her about what he had heard. Not that night. Not the next day. Not ever. Some information he had learned from his father is more powerful when the person who gave it to you doesn't know you have it. Welcome to Folktales by Mason, where real human emotion meets stories that don't let go. If you are new here, subscribe right now and hit that notification bell. You will not want to miss a single story. Drop a comment and tell me where in the world you are watching from. I love seeing every single one of you. Now stay close, because this story is going to take you somewhere most people never see coming. Elliot Dade had never been the kind of man who filled a room with himself. He was medium height, unhurried in the way he moved and spoke, the kind of face that people looked past in social situations because it offered nothing that demanded attention. No performance, no volume, no visible hunger for recognition. He worked as a project consultant for a mid-size infrastructure firm in Columbus, Ohio, and made a decent, unremarkable living. He had been married to Lorraine for 9 years. They had a 2-bedroom house on a quiet street in the Clintonville neighborhood, a shared checking account she used more freely than he did, and for the last 2 years the specific, accumulated distance of two people who had stopped reaching toward each other and were now simply coexisting in the space where a marriage used to be. He had known it was ending long before the hallway. What he had not known, what he had, if he was being honest, refused to examine directly, was exactly what she had already built on the other side of that ending while he was still standing inside it. His father's name was Walter Dade. Walter had lived alone for 15 years in a modest house in Gehenna after Elliot's mother passed, drove a 10-year-old Buick, wore the same 3 colors of polo shirt in rotation, and had been, for 32 years, the silent primary shareholder of a private equity and infrastructure holding company called Westbridge Capital Partners, an enterprise with active positions in transportation, energy logistics, and commercial land development across 9 states, structured through layered trusts, and holding entities specifically designed to keep Walter's name off every public-facing document that existed. He had never sought recognition. He had arranged his life with the particular intelligence of a man who understood that visibility and power are not the same thing and frequently work against each other. To every neighbor, every church acquaintance, every person who had ever seen him at the grocery store on a Saturday morning, Walter Dade was a retired logistics manager with a garden he tended carefully and opinions he shared sparingly. He was, by any external measure, ordinary. That was entirely intentional. And it was, without question, the most important thing he ever taught his son. Walter died on a Wednesday morning in October. A stroke clean and final in his armchair. The television was on low. There was a cup of coffee on the side table, still faintly warm when Elliot arrived. He had called twice that morning and gotten no answer, and had driven to Gehenna with the specific dread that never fully leaves the children of aging parents, no matter how often they tell themselves they're prepared. He found him looking peaceful, the word people use when they mean that death, for once, did not make a mess of a person. Elliot sat with him for a long time before he reached for his phone. The house smelled like cedar and old paper and the particular combination of things that had meant safety to him since childhood. And he let himself sit inside that smell and hold his father's stillness for as long as the world would allow before it came in with its procedures. He did not cry in that room. He would cry later, once in his car, briefly and completely, and then he would carry it the way the Dade men carried things. Inward, permanent, without public exhibition. The funeral was 4 days later. Small. Lorraine stood beside Elliot at the graveside with her hand looped through his arm and her expression arranged in the appropriate register of a supportive wife. He felt the performance of it against his side. He noticed her checking her phone during the pastor's prayer. He noticed the angle of her body, not quite leaning into him, not quite away, maintaining the careful middle distance that had become their default. He noticed her mother whisper something to her at one point and noticed the almost smile that crossed her face before she caught herself. He filed every observation in the same quiet interior space where he kept everything that mattered, and he showed none of it on his face. He had learned from the best. It was 3 days after the funeral, on a Saturday morning, that she came downstairs wearing the expression she wore when she had finished deliberating and was now ready to deliver. She poured coffee, sat across from him at the kitchen table and said, "I think we need to talk about us." Elliot looked at her over his mug. "Okay," he said. She said she hadn't been happy for a long time and that she thought he knew that. He said he knew she'd been unhappy. She used words like growing apart and wanting different things, and the phrase, "I deserve to feel something," with the quiet certainty of a woman who had been rehearsing it long enough that it now felt spontaneous. He let each phrase land and dissolve without catching it. When she finished, he asked one question, "Is there someone else?" She looked at the table, then at him. She said, "I didn't say that." He nodded once. She had not said no. And he had been standing in the hallway 3 nights ago, so he did not need her to. His cousin Marcus called 11 days later, sounding like a man who had been arguing with himself about making the call. He said, "I'm only doing this because you deserve to know." The name was Desmond Farr. Commercial real estate, downtown Columbus, office on High Street, the particular brand of polished confidence that comes from years of being told you are impressive by people who need something from you. Marcus said they had been seen together, that it had been going on for a while, that people at her job had known before Elliot did. Elliot thanked him, hung up, opened his laptop, looked at a professional photo of Desmond Farr. Mid-40s, well-dressed, the smile of a man who had never seriously questioned his own value, and then closed the laptop. He did not feel rage. He felt something colder and more useful than rage. He felt clarity. The divorce papers came on a Thursday, 31 days after Walter's funeral. She had moved efficiently and without visible guilt. The papers had been prepared by an attorney named Patricia Okafor in German Village, a woman Elliot had never heard of, which confirmed what the hallway had already told him. This had been in motion long before she sat down at the kitchen table and called it a conversation. The papers were civil, reasonable in their language. She was asking for the house, her share of the joint accounts, and 18 months of spousal support while she reestablished, as the document put it, financial independence. Elliot read them twice. Then he called Gerald Finch, his personal attorney of 6 years, a precise and unhurried man who operated quietly out of a firm downtown that most people in Elliot's social world had no reason to know about. Gerald read the documents and asked if Elliot wanted to contest. Elliot said not yet. He said, "Give her the house. Give her the accounts. Remove the spousal support clause and sign everything else." Gerald was quiet for a moment. He said, "Elliot, that's the house and $110,000. Elliot said, "I know what it is." Another pause. Gerald said, "Are you certain?" Elliot said, "She wants to go, Gerald. Let her go." And then, more quietly, he said, "Just make sure the reversionary clause is in the property transfer." Gerald understood immediately. He said, "I'll draft it carefully." Elliot said, "I know you will." She did not expect the counter to be that clean. When Patricia Okafor called her with the details, she went quiet and then called Elliot directly. She said, "You're just giving me the house." He said, "Yes." She said, "No fight." He said, "No fight, Lorraine." She was quiet for longer than felt comfortable. Then she said, with the particular edge of someone who has been braced for a battle that didn't arrive, "I always knew you'd fold." He said, "Take care of yourself." He hung up. She called Desmond immediately. She told him Elliot hadn't even tried. She said the word fold again, and Desmond laughed the way men laugh when they believe they have already won. She felt light. She felt free. She began, in her mind, to move the furniture around in a house that she believed, without having read every page of every document her own attorney had prepared, was entirely and unconditionally hers. That assumption, that small, expensive piece of carelessness would cost her everything. But not yet. Not for a while yet. If you are still watching right now, drop the word patient in the comments. Because what Elliot does next is the kind of move that most people only understand when it is already too late to stop it. Let's keep going. The divorce was finalized on a Friday in November. Elliot signed the last document in Gerald's conference room, shook Gerald's hand, and drove to his new apartment near Bexley. Clean, spare, good light, almost no furniture. He unpacked 2 boxes. He ordered food. He sat on his couch and thought about the 9 years the way a man thinks about a house he has lived in for a long time and is seeing clearly for the first time now that he is standing outside it. What had been genuine? What had been maintenance? What he had told himself was patience when it was closer to avoidance. He did not arrive at bitterness. He arrived slowly and honestly at understanding, which is a harder destination and a more permanent one. 2 weeks after the divorce, Gerald called and said it was time. Elliot drove to the office and sat across the mahogany desk and listened as Gerald walked him through the full architecture of Walter Dade's estate. He had known, in the broad outline, that his father had resources beyond what the Buick and the polo shirts suggested. Walter had told him in his late 20s that he had arranged things and that Elliot would understand when the time came. He had taken him once to meet Gerald, briefly, without ceremony, and told him to trust this man with anything. He had told him to live quietly, to let people's assumptions stand uncorrected, to never flash what he had, to save his energy for what actually mattered. "The man who needs to prove himself," Walter had said once on his back porch, sweet tea in hand, the late afternoon light moving across the garden he tended every Sunday, "has already surrendered something he may never recover." Elliot had kept that sentence for years like a key he wasn't sure what it opened. Sitting in Gerald's office, he understood. It opened everything. Westbridge Capital Partners. 32 years of silent, compounding, structurally invisible accumulation. Private equity and infrastructure across 9 states. Trusts layered behind entities layered behind holding structures that kept Walter's name entirely off public documents. Assessed value at the time of death, $1.3 trillion. Gerald said the number the way accountants say numbers, plainly, without drama, adjusted for nothing. Elliot sat with it. He had known the number would be significant. He had not known its exact shape. 1.3 trillion. He nodded once, slowly, picked up the portfolio, and began to read. He did not celebrate. He did not reach for his phone. He read because that was what the moment required, and he was, above everything else, a man who gave moments what they required. The first person outside Gerald's office to understand the full picture was Cecile Watkins, Walter's attorney for 15 years before Gerald took over the estate work. Late 60s, close-cut silver hair, the particular sharpness of a woman who had spent decades in rooms where powerful men underestimated her and had long since stopped finding it surprising. She had attended the funeral quietly, standing in the back, watching everything. When Elliot called her in the 4th week after the divorce, she answered before the second ring. He said it was time to begin the transfer process. She said she'd heard about the house. He confirmed it. She said Walter would have found it genuinely funny. Elliot said he knew. She asked how he wanted to handle the public disclosure. He said carefully and slowly. She told him that once his name attached to this publicly, it would be on every screen in the country. He said he knew. She asked if he was ready. He thought about the back porch and the sweet tea and the late afternoon light and said he had been ready for a long time. He just hadn't been asked. There was, during these weeks, a woman named Adrienne Cole. She was a senior grants coordinator for a nonprofit called the Cornerstone Initiative, an organization focused on workforce development in under-resourced communities across central Ohio. Elliot had met her 8 months earlier at a community planning meeting he had attended in his capacity as a project consultant, where she had given a presentation on funding gaps in vocational training programs that was precise, passionate, and entirely without self-congratulation. They had spoken briefly after. Then again 2 weeks later when he had reached out professionally about a potential advisory connection. Then, over the following months, occasionally and naturally, the way two people find each other in orbit when neither is forcing the trajectory. She was 38, careful with her words, quick with her observations, and she had chosen Elliot's company repeatedly in the months since they met, when he had been, by all visible evidence, a project consultant going through a quiet divorce with not much to show for the marriage. She had not known about Walter. She had not known about Westbridge. She had chosen him in the absence of all of that, which was, in ways he had not yet fully told her, the only thing that would have mattered to him. He had not rushed anything with Adrienne. He had not used the difficulty of the divorce as leverage for closeness or allowed grief to do the work that intention should do. He had let it develop at its own pace, which was the pace it deserved. By the time the Westbridge news broke publicly, they had been seeing each other for 3 months, quietly, without announcement, in the particular way of two people who are not performing a relationship for anyone else. The public disclosure came through routine SEC filings, the kind that financial journalists monitor and most people never see. When Westbridge Capital Partners transferred primary control to a new individual shareholder, Elliot Dade's name appeared in a document that went live on a Wednesday afternoon. By Thursday morning, 2 financial journalists had flagged it. By Thursday evening, it was on 4 industry publications. By Friday, 3 major newspapers had it, and each had done enough background work to understand what they were looking at. One headline read, "Columbus man inherits controlling interest in Westbridge Capital Partners. Estate valued in excess of $1 trillion. Another, less restrained, "The invisible billionaire. Who is Elliot Dade?" The stories described him accurately in most respects and incorrectly in one important one. They called him ordinary. He was not ordinary. He had simply, for 41 years, allowed people who needed that word to use it. She saw the article at 7:15 on a Friday morning, sitting on the edge of the bed in the house that was now legally hers, still in her robe, phone in her hand. She read it once quickly and then started over and read it again slowly, the way you read something when the first pass feels like it must be wrong. Her hand was unsteady by the second paragraph. Desmond had stayed over. He was downstairs in the kitchen making coffee, moving through her space with the ease of a man who had been making himself comfortable in it for long enough to stop noticing he was doing it. She came downstairs and set the phone face up on the counter in front of him without a word. He read it. He looked up. He said, "This is Elliot." Not a question. She said, "That's Elliot." The kitchen held the specific silence of a room where the architecture of everything has just shifted. Then Desmond said, carefully and precisely, "You didn't know." She said, "Of course I didn't know." She said it quickly, which was how she said things she needed to be true. Because here is what she had to sit with in the silence of that kitchen 9 years. She had shared 9 years with this man. His bed, his name, his table, his money, his ordinary Tuesday evenings and Saturday mornings. She had looked at him across all of that time and made a firm, final decision that she knew exactly what he was. She had been wrong in a way that could not be quietly revised or explained away in a phone call to her sister. The calls started within the hour. Her sister Tamara first, voice carefully calibrated between concern and disbelief. Her mother at 8:30, who said Lorraine in a tone that contained an entire conversation. A woman from her office at 9 who wasn't pretending the call was about anything else. Each call had the same shape, shock, then recalibration. Then the question nobody asked directly but everyone was asking, "What did you do?" She kept her voice flat and her answers consistent. She said she had no idea. She said it didn't change anything. She said they weren't compatible regardless of any of this. But when the calls stopped and the house was quiet and Desmond had left for his office, she sat in Elliot's old chair at the kitchen table. The chair where he had sat when she told him she was unhappy, where he had sat when the papers arrived, where he had sat and listened to everything she said without argument or defense or visible pain, and she thought about all of it. She thought about every time she had told him, in the accumulated carelessness of long disappointment, that she needed more, that she was tired of standing still, that she wanted someone who moved through the world like he had somewhere to be. She thought about his face during those conversations. Still, patient, watching her with those quiet, level eyes that she had read as emptiness and had. She was beginning to understand, catastrophically misread. She called him. He answered on the third ring, his voice exactly what it had always been, even unhurried, nothing performed in it. He said her name. She said she'd seen the news. He said he knew. She started to say, "Why didn't you?" and stopped herself mid-sentence because she understood, suddenly and completely, that she couldn't finish it without indicting herself. Why hadn't he told her? Because she had never asked. Because she had closed the book on who he was long before she had finished reading it. She said instead, "I need to ask you something." He waited. She said, "When you signed everything over, the house, the accounts, did you already know what was coming?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I knew enough." She said, "You let me walk away." He said, "You wanted to walk away. I didn't stop you." A pause. "That was the most honest thing I ever did for you." She had nothing to say to that. He said, "Take care of yourself," the same 4 words in the same tone he had used before, and the line went quiet. But that wasn't even the beginning of what was coming. 3 weeks after that phone call, greed arrived. Not dramatically. It arrived the way greed usually arrives in people who believe they have been wronged, dressed as justice. A colleague at her office, someone who fancied herself an advocate, said over lunch, "You know, if you signed those papers while you were emotionally compromised, right after a death in the family while you were under duress, there might be grounds to revisit the settlement." She repeated this to Patricia Okafor. Patricia Okafor, who had not drafted the original property transfer documents and had not read every clause in the counteroffer Gerald Finch had prepared, told her it was worth exploring. She filed a motion to reopen the divorce settlement on the grounds of emotional duress, arguing that she had signed the counteroffer in a period of acute grief and had not fully understood what she was agreeing to. She was, in her own estimation, simply protecting herself. She was, in reality, pulling the only thread in the entire arrangement that Elliot had left deliberately loose. Gerald Finch called Elliot on the morning the motion was filed. His voice was composed and carried, beneath its composure, something that sounded almost like satisfaction. He said, "She filed." Elliot said, "I know." Gerald said, "The reversionary clause is fully enforceable. The moment she initiates legal action against the property transfer, the condition is triggered. The house reverts to the Dade Estate Trust." Elliot said, "Give Patricia Okafor 48 hours to find it herself before we respond." Gerald said, "You want her to discover it on her own." Elliot said, "I want Lorraine to hear it from her own attorney." There was a brief pause. Gerald said, "That's a particular kind of thorough." Elliot said, "My father was a particular kind of man." Patricia Okafor found the clause on the second read of the original counteroffer document, a read she had apparently not performed with sufficient care the first time. She called her client immediately. The conversation was short. The clause was clear. By filing the motion, the condition had been triggered automatically. The property no longer belonged to Lorraine. It had reverted cleanly and legally to the Dade Estate Trust. The house in Clintonville, the house she had asked for, the house Elliot had given without argument, the house she had believed was the solid floor beneath her new beginning, was no longer hers. She had taken it from him with a signature and lost it with one of her own. Patricia Okafor, to her credit, said plainly, "I should have read every page. That was the entirety of the comfort available." Desmond Farr, when he heard, became very quiet. He had been growing quieter and more calculated in his manner for weeks. Ever since the Westbridge news broke and he had understood, with the particular intelligence of a man who navigated financial relationships for a living, that the woman he was with had possessed extraordinary leverage and had not known it and had surrendered it and could not get it back. He had stayed. He had told himself he had stayed because of genuine feeling. But feeling, in Desmond's internal accounting, had always shared space with positioning, and the positioning had just collapsed entirely. She had no legal claim. She had no house. She had, in the revised mathematics of the situation, nothing that changed what Desmond Farr's life looked like. He told her this, to his credit, in person rather than over the phone. He said he thought they had moved too fast. He said the situation had become complicated. He said he cared about her, but that he needed to be honest about where he was. She sat across from him at the kitchen table, Elliot's kitchen table in Elliot's house, in a home she no longer legally occupied, and listened to the careful language of a man extracting himself from a calculation that had stopped working. When he finished, she said nothing. She didn't cry in front of him. She sat with her hands flat on the table and her face composed, and she waited until she heard his car leave the street before she allowed herself to feel the full weight of the room she was sitting in. The annual Westbridge Community Investment Gala was held on a Saturday evening in February at the Renaissance Columbus Downtown Hotel. 250 guests. The kind of Columbus civic money that showed up without announcement, old institutional families and new sector leaders and the board members of every organization that Westbridge had funded in the past decade. It was Elliot's first public hosting of the event as primary shareholder, and Cecile had suggested with characteristic precision that he attend as himself, not as a symbol, not as a statement, simply as the man he was. He arrived with Adrian, which was not an announcement but simply the natural result of being a man who had somewhere to be and someone he wanted beside him when he got there. Adrian wore deep green. She moved through rooms the way she did everything, with focus and without self-consciousness. She knew what Westbridge was. She knew what the evening meant. She had asked him, the week prior, whether he was ready for the visibility of it. He had said he was more concerned about whether she was. She had said, "I chose you when you were a project consultant driving a 6-year-old sedan. I think I'm fine." He had looked at her for a moment and thought about his father and the back porch and the late light on the garden and felt, clearly and completely, that Walter would have approved. She was there because Tamara had been given a table through a nonprofit connection. The Cornerstone Initiative was among the organizations Westbridge funded, and Adrian, in her professional capacity, had coordinated the invitation list. Neither of them had placed her in that room deliberately. The world had done it with the indifference the world brings to its more precise arrangements. She arrived with Tamara and 2 colleagues, dressed carefully in the way of a woman who needed the armor of looking good even when she had no particular reason to feel it. She found her table. She ordered a drink. She scanned the room in the automatic way people scan rooms at events, and then she stopped scanning. Elliot was across the ballroom, standing with a small group near the dais, and the woman in deep green beside him had her hand resting lightly on his arm and was saying something that made him smile. Not the polite social smile she had seen him produce 1,000 times in 1,000 rooms, but something genuine and unguarded, the smile of a man standing next to someone he had chosen freely and well. She recognized that smile. She had not seen it directed at her in years. She was not certain she had ever seen it quite like that. Tamara, beside her, said nothing. She had the grace not to. Later in the evening, Cecile Watkins crossed the room and stopped in front of her. She did it without aggression, without theater. Simply the direct, purposeful movement of a woman who had something to say and had decided the time was right. She said pleasantly, "It's been a while." There was a brief exchange of surface courtesies. Then Cecile said in the same even tone, "He looks well, doesn't he?" It was not a question. She said yes. He did. Cecile said, "Walter always believed that the right woman wouldn't need the proof to choose the man." She let it settle for exactly the right amount of time, which was not long. Then she said, "Enjoy your evening," and walked back across the room toward a group of board members waiting for her. The words remained where Cecile had placed them, precise and permanent, and she stood with her drink and felt something move through her that was not grief and not rage but something more corrosive than either, the specific, irreversible recognition of what she had held and measured and set down. She tried one last time. She called Elliot on a Sunday morning 2 weeks after the gala. He answered. She said his name and then, after a pause, "I need you to know that I'm sorry. Not for the cameras or for anyone else. I'm sorry because I didn't see you. I had everything I needed and I didn't see it." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I believe you, Lorraine." She said, "Is there any?" And he said gently and without cruelty, "No." One word. Complete. She said, "Is it her?" He said, "It was always going to be someone who chose me before she had a reason to. That was the only version that was ever going to work." She understood. She did not argue. She said she hoped he was happy. He said he was getting there. She hung up and sat in the apartment she had moved into after the house reverted. A modest 1-bedroom in Worthington. Nothing like what she had planned her life to look like at this stage. And she sat with the phone in her lap and thought about the hallway. Not her hallway. His. She thought about him standing in a hallway 4 days after his father died, listening to her laugh with another man on the phone, and she thought about the fact that he had turned around and walked back out to his car and never once brought it to the surface. He had let her deliver every blow without defending himself, because he had already decided that the best response to being underestimated was not argument. It was patience. It was the long, quiet, devastating patience of a man who knew exactly who he was and was entirely content to wait for the world to catch up. His neighbor Lou Greer stopped him at the fence on a Tuesday morning in March. dog at his side as always, and said without preamble, "Saw the piece in the magazine." Elliot said, "Lou." Lou said, "You look the same as you did the day you moved in." Elliot said, "That's the goal." Lou looked at him for a moment with the evaluating eyes of a man who had been around long enough to know the real thing when he saw it. He said, "Your father must have been something." Elliot said, "He was." Lou nodded once, said, "Good," and walked on. Elliot stood at the fence for a moment in the early March air and thought that was about right. There is a kind of accounting that arrives not at the end of pain but inside it, the slow, honest audit of what a season of your life actually cost and what it also, in ways you couldn't have predicted, built. Elliot conducted that accounting carefully over those months. He did not arrive at bitterness. He arrived at precision, a clear-eyed understanding of what the 9 years had been, what had been genuine inside them, and what had been the particular loneliness of a man who had chosen to be known by someone who had decided, long before she had enough information, that she already knew all she needed to. He did not hate Lorraine. He understood her. He understood the impatience, the need for visible motion, the exhaustion of loving someone whose depths are not immediately legible. What he could not return to was the willingness to make himself smaller in hopes that someone would eventually decide his actual size was acceptable. He had done that once. He would not do it again. Adrian asked him once, in the easy quiet of an evening in his apartment, what he thought the hardest part of all of it had been. He thought about it for a moment. Really thought, not performing the thinking, and said, "Knowing who I was the whole time and waiting for someone else to decide it mattered." She looked at him. She said, "I decided." He said, "I know." He said, "That's why you're here." Westbridge Capital Partners, under Elliot's leadership, entered a period of deliberate and meaningful repositioning. He committed $200 million to infrastructure development across underserved communities in Ohio and 3 neighboring states. He restructured 2 underperforming divisions, brought in 3 new senior advisors, and began, quietly and without press release, a scholarship endowment in Walter Dade's name that would fund vocational and technical education for 300 students a year. He gave one interview during this period, to a mid-sized financial outlet rather than a national platform, because he had his father's instinct for choosing access over spectacle. When asked about Walter, he said his father had taught him that the way a man holds power reveals whether he deserved it. When asked about his low profile given the size of the estate, he said he found it genuinely easier than people assumed. When asked, carefully and briefly, about the divorce, he looked at the camera and said, "Some relationships end because people aren't honest with each other. Others end because they finally are." He left it there. The quote moved through social media for days. People argued in the comments about what it meant. He did not participate in the argument. The house in Clintonville sat on its quiet street exactly as it always had. The same light through the same windows at the same time of morning. The same neighbors putting trash out on Tuesdays. Cut grass in summer and wet leaves in October and chimney smoke when November came in cold. Nothing about it announced what had moved through it, what had been decided in its rooms, what had been signed and surrendered and lost. It stood, as houses stand, indifferent to its own history. It belonged now to the Dade Estate Trust, managed by Gerald Finch, and would eventually be donated to a community land program that Westbridge was developing in partnership with the Cornerstone Initiative. It would become something useful. It would house something real. It would mean something that had nothing to do with the story of a woman who had asked for it and a man who had let her have it because he understood the difference between a house and a home, and because he had known, from the moment he drafted the counteroffer with Gerald in that quiet downtown office, that she had not. Elsewhere in the city, on a Tuesday evening in early spring, a man sat at a table in a restaurant in the short north with a woman in a blue dress who was telling him something about a new grant application she was writing, her hands moving as she talked, her voice carrying the specific energy of someone who cares genuinely about the work they do. He listened. Not politely. Not with the divided attention of a man present in body but somewhere else in mind. He listened the way he had always listened, completely without performance, with the particular quality of attention that is, in the end, the deepest form of respect one person can offer another. She noticed him noticing. She said, "What?" He said, "Nothing. Keep going." She kept going. Outside, the street was wet from an earlier rain and the lights of the short north were doubled in the puddles on the pavement. And the evening moved around them the way evenings move around people who are not trying to be anywhere other than where they are. That was the whole of it. The people who leave teach you what you were willing to settle for. The people who stay before they have a reason to teach you what you are actually worth. If the story moved you, I want to know which moment broke it open for you. Was it the hallway? The reversionary clause? The way Desmond walked out the same door he had walked in through? Or was it Adrian, the woman who chose him first? Tell me in the comments. And if you have someone in your life who needs to hear a story like this today, share it with them right now. Hit the like button if this story earned it. Subscribe to Folktales by Mason, new stories every single week. Stories that stay with you long after the screen goes dark. I will see you in the next one.